Okay, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our keynote speaker, Joanna Bryson. Joanna is a professor for ethics and technology at the Hertie School in Berlin. Her research focuses on the impact of technology on human cooperation and artificial intelligence, as well as information and communication technology governance. From 2002 to 2019, she was on the computer science faculty at the University of Bath. She has also been affiliated with the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oxford, the School of Social Sciences at the University of Mannheim, and the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. I'm happy to have you here. We're looking forward to your talk.
So AI and human interactions, that was the topic I was asked. I think I was actually asked to talk about how is human interactions different in the context of AI, which is a huge question, and I hope that you're watching some of the other discussions of that too. I'm mostly talking about the social impacts on how we interact with each other at a larger scale. But before I go too far into that, I want to talk about, well, what it is we're talking about, by which I mean intelligence. So this isn't the only possible definition of intelligence, but it's a pretty good one, and it's been around for more than a century. It was invented to think about how do we judge animals, how intelligent are animals when we can't talk to them. So I think it's very appropriate. And the idea is that intelligence is a capacity, so it's not just a binary. There are some things that can never adjust their behavior, but within those things that do adjust their behavior, like thermostats and plants and animals, it's doing the right thing at the right time. So just all we're really talking about here is a form of computation. You're taking a set of information, which is perception. We use perception as a term for taking the context, taking the information that is the context, and then generating an action. All right, I hope that's clear, and I think it'll get clearer as we go. If you can accept that, at least for the time being, and don't worry, there's going to be much bigger ideas than only this idea of intelligence later on, then we have a really easy job to define AI. So AI is the subset of all the intelligent things that someone actually built. They deliberately built it, okay? So it's facilitating our own intentions, right? And I want to point out this idea of deliberately building something is really an important key idea that I think a lot of people that are worried about the impacts of AI have forgotten. There isn't much discussion about the fact we have explicit knowledge about some parts of our memory, some parts of our behavior, but we also still have a lot of implicit or unconscious parts of our behavior. So the explicit or deliberate, like deliberately building something, is a part of human intelligence that people can discuss. So I think that's a very important definition. And of course, what people have trouble with is, why is there any part of human intelligence that's not explicit? Okay, well, that's great, a great question, and it also can help us get over some misunderstandings about artificial intelligence. So I already said that intelligence is computation, transforming the context about the current world into an action. That's a form of computation. And computation is a physical process. It takes time, it takes space, it takes energy. It's not like math, it's not an abstraction, it can never be perfect, it can never be instantaneous. It can be amazingly fast, but there's a carbon footprint to thinking, right? As well as to computing, okay? So modularity is an approach, so here's another definition. It's one way to facilitate computation, or quite a lot of other things. So you take a big problem and you break it down, and then there's less stuff you have to do with each of the components, right? Because a lot of what you do in computation gets harder the more things you're trying to compare. So if you can break it up and say, okay, I'm only thinking about the set of things I might do when I'm playing soccer right now, then that will save you time over if you're also thinking about what it would take to pass the calculus exam at the same time, right? So basic ideas. So this is the idea of tractability. All right, so deliberate and conscious thought are based on a set of modules that are useful for things, lots of things. One is communication. So there's a lot of argument about, did we evolve consciousness in order to communicate? Was that, or, did language in fact make us conscious? Maybe we weren't even very conscious even within historic times. That's been an argument that's been made. Or was consciousness something that was evolved in order to innovate? And there's pretty good evidence that the parts of the brain that that we use that are involved in our consciousness are also involved in things like navigation, like figuring out how to go somewhere you've been before, but from where you are now, you know, that kind of planning. So anyway, this stuff is really useful, but it's also not the best way to get things done. If you've ever done a sport, people will tell you, oh, don't overthink it. You need to get to the point where it's automatic. So there is quite a lot of problems with the stuff that's conscious. So our deliberation is built on top of heuristics, right? Heuristics is a technical term from AI. The rest of this stuff was not technical from AI. But heuristics is basically the idea that you can't think of everything all the way down to the ground, to the basis. And so instead, what we've done is that we come up with just rules of thumb, right? And evolution does that all the time. For a long time, you know, lizards, they walked like this. They were doing push-ups all the time. It took a while until evolution came up with the whole idea of getting your legs sort of under your body. It just takes time, right? So we have a pretty good guess. It's called a heuristic that we've developed from, you know, we found by trial and error, and that's how we move forward, okay? And I'm not necessarily talking about Darwinian evolution here too. Also in our deliberate actions, our culture and our society, we change slowly over time by trying trial and error and learning what works better. Okay, so sometimes when we have an entire edifice based on heuristics, someone will innovate a way to get around those, and that can create disruption of various kinds. All right, so that was one little piece. It was an introduction to AI. Coming back to this thing about what can AI do? Well, obviously it can construct those kinds of disruptions because it helps us to be smarter, right? So more people may find more hacks to get around, you know, governments and laws and basically break things, right? That's possible. But on the other hand, that computation problem is a problem from the machine perspective too, right? It takes time, it takes space, it takes energy to make a machine smart. So one way to make machines smarter is to upload all the great stuff we've done. And so a lot of AI now is programmed by machine learning. And so you can think, well, that sounds like a great idea. We can take all of human knowledge and we can put it into machines. But one of the consequences of that is with all the good stuff, with all the useful things, we also get the stuff we don't want anymore. So that includes things like gender biases, racial biases, these things that we call implicit biases. So now this goes back again, this thing about conscious and unconscious, right? So you may consciously think it's really important that all races or all genders are treated the same, but you've grown up in contemporary society. So it turns out that if you're trying to push buttons, right? If you're trying to match up, like for example, from this slide, men's names with family words versus women's names from career words, that is just going to take you longer than if you do it the other way around. It's just easier to do the thing that you've heard happen more before, okay? So this was called implicit bias, and it wasn't clear to people that that was why it was, just what you've heard before. I've just sort of given away one of my punchlines here. But the exact same implicit biases that psychologists had already measured with colleagues at Princeton, we demonstrated that a lot of the really basic, very simple artificial intelligence that's just based on counting words, I mean, it's really not very complicated, it's not rocket science, has exactly the same prejudices, or I shouldn't say prejudices, it has the same stereotypes. It's learned these things. It's only prejudice if you act on it. That's, again, back to the conscious, unconscious thing. All right. So, but here's that punchline I gave away. It turns out that these exact same sexist AI things, they were called word embeddings, were also incredibly accurate at saying things like what proportion of people holding a job. So here on this side of the screen, the dots are the names of jobs. And what you're seeing here is, for psychology, an enormous correlation. It's a 0.9 correlation between how male the word that was like programmer or nurse or whatever, how male that sounded to the word embeddings, to the AI that had been trained on human language, versus what proportion of people who were male actually, what proportion of people who hold that job really are male, okay? And so you can see that's very well correlated. And the outliers there aren't particular jobs. Well, they are, obviously they're particular jobs, but the problem is that some jobs had like a double barrel name, like domestic engineer. And we just dropped the domestic, so obviously you didn't quite capture the whole thing then. Okay, so yeah, the AI trained on human language replicates implicit biases, which it turns out, one of the things we found actually are also replicating the truth. It turns out that implicit biases reflect a lot of our lived reality, but which isn't to say they're okay, it's to say that we've chosen to live in a world where that's not okay, and so we call those biases, and we say they're stereotypes, and we try to avoid it. But it means, therefore, there's nothing in machine learning. Machine learning is there to learn about the world. That's the easy thing, anyway. Mostly, we're automatically learning about the world. So we have to come up with some other explicit mechanism to correct it. So the other problem, and people that have tried to raise children around these, these speaking as voice assistants or whatever, telescreens, that they have noticed that they will also learn to speak the way to other humans as they speak to AI. Again, consciously, they never wanted to do that, but if you use language a lot in a particular way because you're talking to a machine, that will alter how you speak to people too. So learning is like that. And we have to think about what regularities are we creating when we start populating our world with machines, especially if we anthropomorphize them, especially if we do things like have those machines speak with a language and pretend to be human. Okay. So that's just one piece. Now I'm going to jump around to another piece. Another thing people care about a lot is autonomy. So what does autonomy mean? In artificial intelligence, people tended to mean something like robots that proactively determine their own routes or maybe do something useful. And I've just realized I forgot to turn the sound on my computer, so you're about to hear a lot of noise. Sorry. This is just the early days of AI. I used to be back there. So back when I was a kid, and also I wasn't really a kid, I was like 30 there. Oh well. That's MIT, and then this is my students over here with their robots and showing transparently exactly what the robot is thinking, what its priorities are in real time. In fact, this is 5 times real time. But anyway, the point is that sort of never made sense. There was a lot of complaints about like, oh, but the robot isn't autonomous, you programmed it. Well, you teach kids too. I just showed you how we are programmed by the words we hear, right? Even if it's not explicitly intended, we will be changed by what we hear and what we see, right? So let's use a more useful definition, I would say. I think the most coherent definition of autonomy I've ever heard is international relations. So in that context, autonomy is the capacity for a political region, a country, right, to control what happens within its borders. And actually the UN, the current international order is set up around the idea that the entire world is split into countries, and then those countries are governed, and the governments have an obligation to the well-being of every human within their borders, right? That was something we agreed about 70 years ago. And the whole idea of borders and stuff is Westphalian. That's a couple hundred years. Again, not always how we do things. But now it's not only that you have special privileges within your state, you also have obligations, and you have to take care of any human. You don't get to say whether they're citizens or something that determines whether they have human rights. All humans have human rights. Okay. So this idea of whether you can control, if you really actually do control what happens within your own borders, is obviously very much tied up with security. So do you even have a country? Or are you actually just sort of an extension of some other person's country, right? And again, that isn't necessarily absolute, right? So there's an extent to which all countries are interdependent. One of my countries, I have 2 countries, and one of my countries is just learning about how independent it can possibly be from the EU, right? It's not that, right? Every country in the world is influenced by that large of a group of people. And just because you say, oh, I don't want to be a member, doesn't mean you can be totally autonomous from such a large trade bloc, right? So I think this is important because we're coming back to how AI is altering the way we socialize on some high levels. Is that you could think of this is one of the definitions of war, which is that you assault your enemy's institutions so that they reduce their autonomy with respect to you. So even if you don't take over the country, which you might, that would be the ultimate act of war. But even if you don't take over the country, you might convince countries to do what you think they should do, which is what happened, again, to America in the War of 1812, that we realized, oh, maybe we're not so autonomous from Britain after all, since they were able to burn the White House, right? Among other things, right? Okay, so now you've heard about both my countries that I'm a citizen of. I'm currently living in Germany, and that will come up later too. My point here is that, like intelligence, autonomy is relative and it's never absolute, okay? So let's go back and talk about how AI, and here I say ICT, which is different from AI. It's information communication technology. And I really think that quite a lot of the things we're attributing to AI do have to do with the fact that we've had this digital revolution and that information and property can move so fast, so quickly, so cheaply, right? Again, it's not free, it's not spontaneous, it's not instantaneous, and it does take energy. There is a cost, but the cost is so much lower than it was when you were like moving stuff around with suitcases or flying in the air. I remember when we used to do that. It was amazing. Anyway, so we know that we can recognize, and this is a big deal from the 2015 I thought that this thing about Connect, that Microsoft was sitting there, they did all these experiments, they published them and said, we can tell how you're going to vote and if you're going to get divorced and things like that by how you interact with your game console, right? I thought that was going to be a challenge for the 2016 elections. I knew about the Facebook thing, but who took Facebook is just a toy, right? Nobody is worried about that. The same stuff we could do with Facebook, we can do with Twitter. If people have figured out just from tweets, you don't have to get someone to like anything, just from the tweets themselves, you can also determine people's personality. And of course, the social media does not change people's minds. Not about 2%, which is of course about what the last American and British elections were decided by. But maybe 2% of people can be persuaded on social media to change parties. But what it can persuade you is that your fringe idea is not as fringe as you thought. So maybe you should act on it. Maybe you should go out and actually, I don't know, have a riot or vote or get other people to vote. Maybe you should get together. So these are the kinds of things that we've been doing. And Chris Wiley, of course, did a big whistleblowing on this with respect to Cambridge Analytica. And again, maybe we're all sick of hearing about my two countries, but it isn't just there. It's happening all over the world. In fact, the company that owned Cambridge Analytica had been paid by Western governments for 30 years to influence other people's elections, right? So anyway, this is a really scary article about how WhatsApp was completely co-opted during the Brazilian elections of 2018. So this is something that is absolutely compromising personal autonomy, but that actually is not my area of expertise. I've been really interested lately in what's happening again at the governmental level and also corporate level. How are we coordinating these larger entities? And of course, when you have a lot of money, you can also influence other countries, as we were just discussing before. And I really recommend this Pistor's book about Code of Capital. It's really nice. I also really recommend going to see Hamilton if you can. It's awesome. Anyway, so where are we? So when you have really high levels of inequality, when small numbers of people, and that's the dark gray line on this graph, on the left, you see the percentage share that the top 1% of earners in America had per year. The bottom there is years. When you have very high levels of inequality, and it wasn't just America, that just happens to be where Nolan McCarty, who's one of my collaborators, is from, and I got his slides. He has great data. We had globally very high inequality in the late, increasing and then peaking around this period in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And now we have globally very high inequality. Actually, not globally. The problem here is mostly in the OECD. I'll come back to that. I mean, anyway, the well, what's that lighter gray line? The lighter gray line is about political polarization. And the darker gray line is actually income inequality, because that was what we knew about, because in America, we just eradicated alcohol tax and alcohol. Well, not really, we just stopped taxing it and made it illegal. Anyway, the point is that we had that information, but it seems that the wealth inequality does more of the driving. And more recently, that's been better correlated with income. Maybe, we'll see. Anyway, what you do see also is that after one world war and one financial crash, that was enough entropy that a bunch of the affluent, the elite, decided, okay, this is too much. We're losing too much stuff here. I mean, a lot of the poor people were killed, right, in the wars. But the elite are saying, yeah, this is too much mayhem. We have to do something. And so in America, this was the New Deal. And so you see this, that polarization was brought down first, and then inequality followed. And you have this long period of relative low. I mean, it wasn't a perfect period. Lots of stuff happened in the 60s and 70s too. But compared to what happened in 1978, when these broke apart again, that's a big deal. A lot of people go around saying, oh, the great decoupling. And one of the things I want to point out is there was a great coupling. It wasn't just natural, it didn't just happen that we just followed productivity. That is a choice. So yeah, when you have shrinking numbers, so growing inequality means that you have like a Zips curve is the technical term. Fewer and fewer people have more and more stuff, all right? And that just breeds entropy. You know, you don't have to cooperate as much. In fact, you want to be eccentric, you want to have weird beliefs because you want to make sure that the politicians you're paying are only being paid by you. There's all kinds of things that could be going on. So we think that what technology actually does is reduces the new technology that reduces the cost of distance, also reduces the number of winners. And so I think that's what bootstraps this problem, but then you get something called regulatory capture. So the people who are winning try to stop you from taking their money away and sharing it again until you convince them that this is too much entropy again, right? So there was a period of great coupling, and I told you what happened in America. Globally, after World War II, after the Second World War, there was an agreement called the Bretton Woods Agreement that reduced things like, for example, transnational transfers. So after World War I, huge amounts of money was being extracted from quite a lot of countries that were basically randomly selected by the entropy that was World War I. And so those countries couldn't get over their inequality. Some countries like Russia, Afghanistan, Greece, have always, not always, but quite often, having all their wealth extracted by their own elite because they're trying to maintain that inequality. It makes them feel safer. They're just wrong. Okay. Anyway, so the point is that we can fix this. It's not that we solve all of society's problems. We can reduce the amount of entropy and get to a better calm if we decide to invest in that. And when we don't invest in that, again, I started to keep harping about Brexit, but this is amazing that such a rich country as the UK can go to a point where people don't have enough food, don't have enough education. They don't have like days of school shut down, even before COVID, right? It's just insane, right? And this, you know, that the UN has to come in and document that the UK is starving its own people. It's just amazing, right? This is just another thing. If only you guys were here live with me, I'd be trying to make you guess what this is about. So somebody's winning and somebody's losing, but when are they winning or losing? It's global warming. So the impact of global warming. So again, who benefits if we don't actually have a way to enforce the rules about global warming, right? Actually, you know, Finland, but they seem to be playing ball with the EU. So anyway. As I mentioned, wars dismantle your enemy's infrastructure so that they lose autonomy. Their goals are subsumed by yours, Okay, so regulation is the means by which a complex entity perpetuates a recognizable version of itself into the future. Regulation is not a bad thing, all right? It's what every single living thing does and every company does. We all have to regulate, and certainly, obviously, it's what governments do. Societies and individuals have to regulate. Governance is, again, the explicit, deliberate regulation that we do with the government, right? Or we can do it with our own, again, corporate governments, right? but it's the subset of regulation. All right. So when what does it mean to govern? It means you change the problem, you address it with resources, and then you stabilize and move on. Okay. And people are like, well, can we trust that? You get that a lot from people like Google. Can we trust the government? Of course not. No, you should never trust the government. You've got to actually make sure it works. You can't just leave things up in the air, okay? So we have to work with the government, but it is one of the means by which we make it easier to ensure everyone does their fair share, all right? So yeah, modularity, also in society. It's great to have companies, it's great to have governments, and it's great for them to find ways to work together and to simplify each other's jobs and to police each other's corruption. Okay, so we did that. We actually, in the OECD, we had a whole bunch of people get together over multiple years, and they came up with some really good ideas about how to handle AI, right? And it should be accountable, it should be safe, it should be transparent, there should be some kind of justice and supporting of diversity, and most importantly, it should be human-centered, and not only human. There's a nice lines about sustainability and worrying about the planet here, okay? And so, you know, what could we be doing with these kinds of agreed principles? I think that, yeah, that humans are both the point of AI and the limit to how much things can change at a time. So this idea that everything's running way faster and faster and we can't control it, well, that's how it felt in the late 19th century too, okay? But that's something that we're doing to ourselves. So we will always have the human condition. The fact that we're alive implies that we're gonna die. Sorry, Elon Musk, or whoever it is that thinks, I don't know if that's one of his things. And if we're gonna die and be alive, we're gonna have children and families. The human condition is what is gonna be for humans, right? and machines are quite dependent on us. They're a lot more fragile than life. Okay, so everything could become clearer. Now that if we were actually to apply these principles that I mentioned earlier, that 44, I think, nations have signed up and said, yes, we want these principles, including China. The G20 also signed up to those. All right. So everything could be clearer, and companies and governments could be more transparent, right? They could be, and we could actually govern both our corporations and our governments better, as long as we had cybersecure AI and digital technology to help us all understand what was going on, including the people in government, right? Social mobility could be higher. Education could be more accessible, right? Countries that support transparency, good governance, may in the long run still win. I think it's quite likely. You know, I really believe that what we do matters. And I also really believe there's hope. Otherwise, I would just go home and drink, right? I don't need to be here. So let's talk about utopia, okay? I think utopia is a utopia that has to do with AI. Would be, you know, happy, fulfilled, localized, sustainable, and hedonistic. Mentioning the drinking. Doesn't have to be alcohol, sorry. Some kind of consumption. Creative cultural economies, real-time translation, so that, you know, that those of us who are native English speakers don't have this ridiculous advantage, like that we could really support and sustain and flourish more languages and more ways of thinking, right? We could, I think in order to avoid the kinds of predation and manipulation we've been seeing, we need to also build technological solutions that will defend our privacy, will defend us from knowing what we might do, right? You know, I think we need to have liberty. We aren't going to enjoy our lives otherwise. I think that, as I mentioned, we need to have governments and corporations working together, and also NGOs. There's all kinds of new entities that are coming up as we are becoming so wealthy and so powerful. So we need to defend the right to flourish and freedom of thought. And we need to limit each other's corruption, right? And it's important that citizens, we don't just leave this to other people, that citizens are vigilant and that we all look for ways to help each other and to help our society. So that's the good idea. What if we get it wrong? I think if we get it wrong, we know what it's like. Again, this is the human condition. We know the worst that we can do to each other, right? And we're seeing it right now. I just named a few places here, but obviously there's other people suffering, Myanmar and Uyghurs, and, you know, all kinds of things are happening. But we know what it's like to be micromanaged. You don't have to have AI to do that. We know that there's people that don't care about human lives, or not everybody's lives anyway, right? So sometimes people think it'd be better to hold on to their fragile power by making a more homogeneous population. And I worry right now, I don't think people are talking about this enough, to what extent is it the people who think like, oh, technology is all we need, we don't need this many people, so we'll just let people attrition away. Well, we don't need to give them adequate healthcare anymore. I think there are a number of people that I fight with on Twitter sometimes that believe that human goals could be met adequately by technology alone. I think they aren't thinking hard enough. And the other piece here is that if you remove diversity, you will lose your capacity to innovate. So again, long term, you lose. Just like China with the Cultural Revolution. After 10 years, they suddenly realized that they didn't have the academic knowledge that they needed to be competitive with the Soviet Union or with America, right? So, but a lot of people died in those 10 years. So I'm just trying to help people think about this a little sooner. Yeah, and obviously destruction of the ecosystem can lead to other shorter lifespans and higher infant mortality, and those are things we really don't like. The best prediction of a state failure is having increasing infant mortality. So is it possible for us to get to the utopia? Actually, I already did. I moved to Berlin, and it seems to be absolutely awesome here. I told you I'd mention my third country. All right. Yeah, look at this. These guys, this is my commute. There's this guy with a dog on his commute. I can't believe it. Anyway, okay. When there's been a big change, like say there's been a landslide here, right? Then there's nothing is working. And then you get this really simple plants that come in, right? Like weeds, right? But without those simple plants that get there first, you don't get the jungle growing back, right? So something has to stabilize the soil. And this is my current thinking about, like, we've changed what it is to be human and how we interact so much that we get these autocracies. They're very simple. They're like weeds sweeping in. And we need to now try to get in and say, okay, can we grow and expand the richer ecology of better, more diverse forms of governance and get those out to these other areas. So how can we do that? Well, first of all, whatever we're doing, we need to make solutions that are sustainable ecologically as well as emotionally and politically. And we have to invest in public goods. We have to think. We have to not think that, oh, you know, this is all hopeless, and then try to sit on our own money. We have to put our effort and our taxes and our vigilance into our society and our neighbors. Just protest is great. You know, there's a lot more to democracy than just voting. But what we've seen over and over in the last 20 years is that only protest, you know, you can make it harder for the governors to govern, but it doesn't replace the government. You've got to join into institutions. You have to join things like unions and political parties and all these things that we sort of hate. But that is where you get enough coherence that you can move forward. We need to recognize and strengthen the institutions that are already protecting us, even if they're not perfect. You know, it's like put your oxygen mask on first, then fix the other oxygen masks, okay? And we need to value and care for ourselves and our neighbors. I think that's obvious, but it's not enough. Some people are just saying, oh, that's all we need to do. No, nope. All right, and thank you.
Right, thank you, Joanna.
I have no idea how long that took.
We are at 32 minutes now, so we have time for...
Nailed it.
Nailed it. So we have time for a couple of questions. And I want to start actually at the end where you said protest is not enough, we should join unions. And I recently watched a talk by I recently watched a talk by Noam Chomsky, and he's very into the anarcho-syndicalist way that the institution constantly has to prove its power. And when you say join the union, what do you say about that notion?
Yeah, well, yeah. I don't always keep up with Chomsky, although I have read him at various periods. And he's actually one of those people who's a bit of a disruptor himself if you look for his internal coherence. But the point is, yes, definitely. I grew up, for some reason, I guess because I was from the Midwest, I thought unions were a good thing. But when I was growing up, they were mostly linked to the mafia, right? And it wasn't seen as a very good thing. And it was a real problem when people were trying to impose unionization on, for example, the musicians in Chicago. I'm from Chicago. because that meant they basically had to join the mafia. You know? So I understand skepticism. Like I said, no institutions are perfect. It's an ongoing attempt to improve things. But we do keep building more amazing stuff. We are, you know, the well-being and healthcare of the poor. You know, 4 billion people were moved out of extreme poverty in the period from 2000 to 2015. Yeah, that's despite 2008 being in the middle of that, right? And that isn't just China and India, right? It was in Africa too, right? And in the you know, the Pacific Islands, all these, you know, these huge parts of the world. The point is that I think a lot of it, part of it was just that effective altruism is actually effective. but part of it was also, unfortunately, that Western governments were spending less money on, this is the theory, right? That giving less money, doing less charity, because a lot of the charity was getting captured by the top, and the top was therefore motivated to keep the inequality high and have these poor people. But where if you take that charity part out and instead replace it with say, the Chinese coming in and buying stuff, then they needed actual employees. Of course, they brought a lot of employees, but still some money was trickling out. And I think that's also how we achieved that greater equality and the wages following productivity in the United States. We you know, it was completely sexist and racist. We only gave money to white uneducated males, and we pumped up, and not all of them, like a small number of them, but we pumped up their wages. That, you know, let them be in the aerospace or whatever. And now that that's collapsing, that's really cheesing them off, right? They don't see, they're still better off than everybody else, but they're not as much better off. And so now they're actually withdrawing from the labor market. Big problem. Anyway, the point is that there seems to be, even if you just get something to people, then they will spread it around. It helps glue the society together, and it does give you security. So anyway, and the thing about moving all those people out of extreme poverty, that was pre-COVID. I think there are a lot of people now that are again at food risk, you know, malnutrition risk, because of the breakdown supply chains and things. So we need to rethink that. We need to figure out how to get supply chains that are, you know, that there's redundancy, that there's some kind of localization, although a lot of globalization worked well in other ways. So we you know, there's an ongoing level of improvement, but I think we should be proud of what we have achieved. Oh, and I didn't say, part of it was AI, right? Yeah. Part of it was not just AI, ICT, that people had mobile phones and they could find out, you know, what their stuff was worth, and they could find out what the weather was going to be. And, you know, that's amazing. And a lot of the world hadn't had access to that. And now almost everyone can communicate. That's incredible.
Yeah. I agree, and that was certainly one of the parts in the paper I really liked, that you mentioned the positive effects of AI and what could be done with it, because I get the feeling in the media there's a lot of fear mongering with AI, and especially about the manual labor and jobs. I mean, I don't say those are not problems we should think about, but I really enjoyed that you stressed also the positive effects. It needs more. More of this.
I gotta tell you something about manual labor. I just learned the most amazing thing. Academics are cool. and some of them invited me to a meeting like last week. And I'm sorry, I don't have the citations in this talk. I can't remember the speakers, but go to my Twitter page and ask me, and I will send you this. In fact, I'm gonna blog this. It was so cool. Anyway, so there's these kinds of things people think are exposed to AI, like these repetitive tasks, you know, famously, right? So somebody had done this big paper about repetitive task, the wages for people that were doing repetitive tasks. And this individual had looked at how unions protected those people. And they're like, oh, look, if you're in a union, your wages stay high. Of course, fewer and fewer people are in unions. This is the United States. In Germany, the unions are really well integrated into society. It's very cool here. It's so cool what they're doing. Anyway, the point is that that then the wages are plummeting over with the non-union people. But wait, they're only plummeting from 1983 to 1995. And I'm just like, dude, wait, if this is AI, why is it over in 95? He's like, well, we economists have a theory that there's been no real advances in AI since 1995. I'm like, I think your theory is wrong, you know? And then, but there's other people. So it was even at the same meeting, there was these other people. So in Germany, that period of wage reduction for those with repetitive skills was was the 90s. Okay. And so they said, oh, is it because we had stronger unions, so we held on longer? No, it was because the wall came down. Okay. So what competes with people? People. Wages go down when the supply of people expands. So what happened in America in the 80s was the access to the market to China, to Asia, and the massive outsourcing. And then when the wall came down and the Iron Curtain came down, that happened in Germany. That was when the unions finally capitulated, said, okay, the wages can go down now because we don't want you to move to, Poland or something. Actually, Poland's in the EU now. But anyway, whatever they said in the 90s, that probably was what they said, right? Anyway, so the point is that if you look at the people now who are having their jobs automated, so that was like those periods where the wages were falling, and they, there is still increasing inequality. I don't want to make light of it, but if you look at the people now who have their jobs automated, the majority of them stay in work, and of those, the majority of them have they get better jobs. They get less repetitive, more abstract, better paid jobs, mostly in the same companies. So it turns out that even within sector, this is not a sector difference, even within sector, the same companies that invest in technology tend to also invest in education of their own workforce. And maybe it's not a coincidence because otherwise the workforce would freak out. But anyway, the point is that it isn't, the story isn't as simplistic as people make out. I mean, I never believed some of those numbers that people were kicking around, but there is way more evidence now that, and I do worry about this. So remember I said there is still a role that AI could play here, right? Because one thing that AI does is it makes it easier to get skills faster. Basically, the skills are in the machine. So you just have to buy the machine. You buy the GPS or something, right?
Yeah.
So then that would indicate, again, that wages are going to go down because we could all be taxi drivers, right? And for some people, that's a better wage, but for the taxi drivers, that's a worse wage. And so, well, actually not. That's, again, middle management. Anyway, it's complicated. The point is, that I do think that we need to make sure, again, that we are adequately redistributing into infrastructure that makes our lives fun, that makes us want to participate. And that's why I said earlier, it's a real problem. There's some parts of society, like, for example, in North America, the white males right now, white uneducated males, feel like it's not worth either going to school or getting a job. Right? Yeah. That their reserve wage is higher than what they're able to get. Because, we can just wait till they die. But I would rather find something that would engage them and make them feel like, no, this is a society I want to participate in.
But would you agree that of course, distribution of technology is very important for democratization and autonomy, of course. But I do get the feeling, for example, for right-wing people, that it's easier to convey easy messages which are not complex. I mean, you have this technology, very complex, but it's still easier to convey like the simple message and the simple solution with this tech.
I wouldn't say right wing. I would say extremes. That everybody is happy to market a simple message. That is one of the challenges of democracy. We've always known that you need really good education to have a democracy. That's just essential. But I do think, again, that we can keep thinking. People love to learn. Even monkeys love to learn. You put them in a room, they'll sit there and figure out puzzles too. You don't even have to give them peanuts; they'll just do it, right? So people love to learn. And if we can again put a priority on and put some kind of rewards behind making this accessible, helping people to understand and solve these problems instead of just watching, child porn on YouTube or something. Sorry, I shouldn't. Sorry, YouTube. But if we can find things, if we can let, even again, it doesn't. You don't need the whole planet to solve every problem. Even one person solving a problem really well and communicating it is a big win.
Right. So, Joanna, thank you very much for this keynote and the discussion afterwards, the short discussion. It could be longer, of course. I mean, it's a huge topic, but I hope, this discussion will be continued.
Yeah. And I will be, when this talk is going on now, when you guys are listening to this, I will be around in some sense of around. So go ahead and get on Twitter. I'm happy. I would love to do Q&A. I might, in fact, I think I'm going to be in a panel like immediately after this, but I think there's a little bit of a gap. Anyway, go ahead and ask questions. I'm sorry about this pre-recording part.
So thank you very much. And yeah, see you.